lesson 1 is going to be talking about genetics, and we're going to start out talking about heredity. And heredity is the passing of traits from parents to offspring. So I'm going to guess that lots of you have been told several times in your lives that, oh, your eyes are like your mom's, or you've got your dad's dimples, or something like that. The reason is because of this idea of heredity. So your parents passed their traits to you. So when we study how those traits are passed from parents to offspring, we're studying genetics. Genetics was discovered by this guy over here. His name is Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk. So he lived in a monastery and studied pea plants. And because of all of his work with the pea plants and the things that he discovered as he worked with those pea plants, we call him the father of genetics. So he's a pretty important guy. If you go to this YouTube address up here at the top of this slide, you will be able to watch a really interesting little movie that explains Mendel's experiments. We watched this one in class, so you have all of this information from watching that video. So let's talk about Mendel's experiments. What he did was he crossed pea plants to study 7 characteristics. So he looked at things like plant height, flower color, pod shape, location of flower, pod color, seed shape, and seed color. So there are 7 of those things. And what he did was he controlled which plants pollinated other plants. So remember, for plants to reproduce, you have to have pollination involved. And we'll talk about a couple of different kinds of pollination in relation to Mendel's experiments here in a couple seconds. So the first kind is self-pollination. So in self-pollination, it's exactly what it sounds like. The plant contains both male and female reproductive structures, and the pollen from the plant is transferred to the ovule or the egg of the very same plant. So it pollinates itself. So its own pollen is transferred to its own egg. So that's self-pollination. Self-pollination, here's a quick little easy example. So that pollen is transferred from that plant to itself. So that would be self-pollination. The other kind of pollination is cross-pollination. So in cross-pollination, what happens is pollen from one plant gets transferred to the ovule of a different plant. So cross-pollination is going to look more like this example down here. So pollen from this plant is going to be transferred over here to this plant. So it goes to the egg or the ovule of this plant. So they're crossing. So if it pollinates itself, like this one, then it's self-pollination. If it pollinates a different one, then it's cross-pollination. Okay, so now that we know about those 2 kinds of pollination, we can talk a little bit more about exactly what Gregor Mendel did. So we have what we call his first experiments and his second experiments. So in Mendel's first experiments, what he did was he used these plants that were called true breeding. So what that means for a plant to be true breeding is that when it's allowed to self-pollinate, the offspring are always going to have the same traits as the parent. So for example, if it was a white flower and it's self-pollinated, all of the offspring will be white flowers. They're going to have the same traits as the parents. So he used those true breeding plants, and what he did was he cross-pollinated the plants for each trait. So what that means is that he took the purple flowered plants and crossed them with the white flowered plants. Or he took the tall plants and crossed them with the short plants, or whatever other trait we're going to be talking about. So those true breeding, so those ones that always had the same trait as the parent, he cross-pollinated those. And what happened was, of course, there were some offspring, which we will call hybrids. But what happens is that in all of those crosses, one trait showed up while the other seemed to be gone. So it was like it disappeared. So, for example, in our example where we said we crossed the purple flowers with the white flowers, all of the offspring ended up with purple flowers. So the white seemed to have disappeared. Well, so this makes Mendel start thinking, right? He's trying to figure out why, what happened to the white? So that leads him to his second experiments. So in his second experiments, what he did was he took those first generation plants and self-pollinated them. So those hybrid plants, those plants that were made from that first experiment, he let them self-pollinate. And what showed up was some with the recessive trait, or the trait that seemed to disappear. So, for example, remember we started out with those purple flowers, we crossed them with the white flowers, and we ended up with all purple, right? So then he took those all purples and he let them self-pollinate. And what happened was he got some purples, but he got some whites also. Now remember, all of those parents this time would have been purple, but some of the offspring were white. So he's got those purple flowers with purple flowers, so they self-pollinate, and he ends up with some white-flowered offspring. Well, this, of course, makes Mendel start thinking even more. And we'll get to those conclusions in a couple seconds. So let's look at the experiments summarized first. So what happened? Okay, so he takes these true breeding purple flowers, crosses them with these true breeding white flowers. All of the offspring are purple. Then he takes these purple flowers, which are now called hybrids, right? He takes these hybrid purple flowers and lets them self-pollinate. So purple, purple, and ends up with offspring that are both purple and white. So basically what happens is, in the first experiment, Mendel's going, well, where the heck did those white flowers go? All we've got left are these purple flowers. Then, in the second experiment, he's wondering, how in the world did these white flowers come back? Where did they come from? So what he decides through all of this experiment, and because he didn't just do this one time, he did this many times, and he kept super detailed notes about every cross he did and all of the offspring that were produced and all of those things that were going on. So what he comes up with is this idea that each trait is controlled by two genetic factors. One of those factors comes from each parent. So this is that whole idea that you get half of your traits from your mom, half of your traits from your dad. So those factors then can be either dominant traits. So dominant are the ones that appear. So I like to say that, the dominant dominate. So they're the tough ones. They're the ones that are there. They dominate. They show up. They're the ones that you see. So these are the ones that are going to block out the other factor. You can kind of think of it like, if you took the noisiest kid in your class and the quietest kid in your class and you put them together and had them walk into the room together, who's the one you're going to notice first? Right? It's going to be the noisy kid because they're going to be dominant. So it's the same idea here, is that one of these traits is going to block out the other factor. It's going to dominate. It's the one that you're going to see. We represent the dominant trait with a capital letter. And I have that written here, kind of running down the side here. Okay, so when we talk about dominant traits, we're representing those with capital letters. The recessive traits are like the quiet person. So they're the trait that seems to disappear, the one that doesn't get noticed. So they are blocked by the other factor. So the dominant factor blocks the recessive factor. And we represent these with a lowercase letter. And we'll talk about all of that in, a little bit later when we start doing our Punnett squares and things. So, but just remember that dominant traits are represented with a capital letter, recessive traits are represented with a lowercase letter. Dominant traits, again, remember, those are the ones that are dominant. They dominate, they block the other thing out. The recessive ones are the quiet ones. They're the ones that kind of disappear. They get covered up by the other one. Okay, you can find a table that looks a lot like this in your textbook, just so that you know what the dominant trait and the recessive trait for each one of Mendel's characteristics are. So this is going to be really important when you're doing the Punnett squares that we're going to get to pretty soon. So make sure you probably bookmark that page in your textbooks, just so you know what those are. And that is going to end our lesson 1. And